these make women and low caste and the less empowered very vulnerable. There can be a lot that can be said about community mediation, because even our courts are harsh and corrupt and the system of justice takes very long and is very hard to access. So in a society, one does need conflict resolution mechanisms, and one has to have them close at hand and fast, and there has to be some acceptability of that. So, but those may be the cases for one, but like sati, so also over custody, so also over one's sexuality, one's love, even, in the most intimate matters, women particularly become very vulnerable and also even such things as witchcraft in tribal societies, we find that, and even disputes over properties, they always spill over and become cases where women become very vulnerable. They are dispossessed of property, their heads are shaved, they are paraded half naked, and finally they are thrown out. So if one may argue that not all cases of public mediation are cases of injustice or cruelty, but injustice and cruelty does happen, and happen more to women and poorer people. So that is a question that we have to grapple with. No, Lord Bentinck was perfectly right, and even now we should pass all kinds of laws and support all kinds of practices which empower women. How we deal with the community traditional norms is something that we have to figure out.
Okay, I'm going to ask this question to both of you, so you can take your turn in answering. And it's related to what Swati has just said. What sort of changes over 40 years that you've been reporting from India have you noticed coming about in India? I mean, is it perceptible? Do you have to go deep? What sort of changes?
Well, it's certainly, yes, it's huge, I think. I used to have a kind of way of categorizing where I was in India, because I was a smoker in those days. So I used to think there's places where I can buy India Kings, that was metropolises. There were places where I could buy Classic, which would include metropolises and large cities. There were places where only Gold Flake was available, which might be in big towns. Finally, there's places you could only buy Panama or Charminar. They tended to be the bigger villages. And lowest rung of all were the places you could only buy birrias. So I had a kind of cigarette chart of India in my head. I think that you never, I mean, smoking is no longer a very accurate gauge of anything because so few people do it in big cities. But I think there are more people smoking Classic now than there were when I was here at first. You never see rickshaw pullers with bare feet, at least I haven't seen any this time. In all kinds of tiny ways, people, even poor people, seem to be less poor than they were. Again, that's just a personal observation. And I think, I mean, the huge change is that if you have money in India, and many people seem to have lots of money, then anything can be bought. I remember I had in-laws once upon a time in Ballygunge, and I would sometimes want to make a salad for them as a treat on a Sunday. So I'd go to the New Market and buy apples and walnuts and lettuce. I'd try to make a Waldorf salad, really. But then I'd need olive oil, and the only place I found you could buy olive oil was Great Eastern Stores, which I passed the other day and found to be the headquarters of Bose Electronics. So there was Great Eastern Stores you could buy olive oil, and that was pretty well it. This is about 1980, 1981. And now you seem to be living in a kind of great, even Calcutta, which is the kind of, I guess, the least touched by economic liberalization of any Indian city, the least touched by it. But even in Calcutta, the kind of cornucopia effect of Indian life now among the upper middle classes and upwards of them is tremendous. I mean, I used to come to India and people would say, bring me a Marks and Spencer shirt. Nobody's ever going to say that anymore. I mean, that's just gone.
And you get all varieties of olive oil, especially in the new Spencers and Quests.
Well, I'm pleased to hear it. So that has just gone, and something has gone with it, which is maybe not so, maybe slightly to be regretted. Maybe to be regretted has gone with it. A kind of simplicity, not simplicity, a kind of austerity, which was somehow pleasing to be part of for a while. But you see, the trouble with being a visitor is that everything's pleasing to be part of for a while, but in the end, you think, I'm going to go home. To live here in austerity might have been a completely different thing.
Yet, I think you, Ramchandra Guha described you, compared you with Verrier Elwin, which I thought was, very appropriate, the way he said it, because Ian, you really bring that kind of deeper understanding to what you write. I want to ask Shati, have you noticed this change, or what kind of change have you noticed when you travel to the villages and outside of the city limits?
Well, one of the stories, just to take up on what Mr. Jack was saying, one of the stories that we did recently is that, chire, it's that flattened rice that Bengalis have always loved, but now the factories for making chire, they are just disappearing. They have come down a whole lot because, we even had songs, our folk songs on Shali Dhanir Chire. So that used to be a delicacy. And for us, I think when we used to come home from school, that was our standard snack. But now there is so much of instant noodle that even though muri finds a little bit of space, that's puffed rice, but chire is completely going out of fashion. So yes, there are a whole lot of changes in preferences, and as Mr. Jack was saying, in the cities you find everything. In the rural areas you find all those things, but in smaller packets. And in cheaper versions. And in fact, in Poverty Action Lab, where I was working for a while, where the economists are constantly scratching their heads over, how to lift the poor out of poverty, one of the things that they are worried about is that in South Asian countries, there are so many things to buy for small amounts of money. The mobile talk time or plastic trinkets and stuff like that, that people don't spend enough on food. Whereas in Africa, because most things are very expensive, people spend a lot more, the poorer people spend a lot more of their money on nutritious grains, because grains only are the affordable things over there. So this is one of the puzzles that we have, and yes, it is much more nicer and much more pleasant to have a whole lot of stuff which is available to you to buy from, but that is having many kinds of effects, and not all the effects probably are good for us.
That's what I wanted to ask you again. Is this for the better? Have lives changed to the extent that they feel it's more worth living, if you want to put it that way? I won't use the word happiness because you can't really describe it. I won't say are they happier, but is it change to provide them with the kind of things that they would aspire to? And what sort of course things have changed, but to what extent is your understanding, or is your perception, or is your experience of that?
Well, for one thing, I myself was recently doing a survey in Birbhum, and I found that even among the about 200 BPL families that I had in my sample, about 56 owned a TV. So, and it must be immensely satisfying to have a TV at home. We all know that there is no reason to think why the poor or the village people will think any differently. And it is true that I think that in many ways people have discovered that satisfaction. The terrible boredom of having nothing to do after dark has disappeared for a lot of people. But it is also true that the drive to get things which at least apparently to us, are trinkets, has in many ways destabilized livelihood patterns, family patterns. You would find young girls moving away from villages, not always in very safe professions, because they want those attractive things as quickly as possible. You would find young boys giving up studies to start some kind of work so they can buy a mobile phone with a camera. The camera is important. What tune he can play in the mobile is important. So people, a lot more poor people, they definitely earn more than before. Even our studies show that rural income has gone up. But it is also true that many of them are spending beyond their means.
With 950 people, 950 million having a mobile phone and about 100 or 150 having a smartphone.
But there's no going back, though, is there? You can't go back. I mean, I think people. I mean, my father, for instance, would have an orange once a year at Christmas, and remembers going to school once or twice in his bare feet. Now that's an Edwardian childhood. I mean, I can't conceive of that, and my children certainly can't conceive of it. So it's very difficult, as the Green movement frequently find. The great problem for it's a Gandhian problem, really, I suppose, is getting people to vote for less is a very difficult thing to ask them to do. Voting for less never happens. Renunciation of goods is a very, very rare occurrence.
Ian, you have traveled to India for so long and you really understand what India is about. What do you think about people around you in Britain? Do they understand this India and the kind of image that Shati is talking about? Or what's the,
Well, it's difficult to generalize, I guess, but in a way they know more than I did when I came to India. I mean, I was remarkably ignorant when I came to India. I had read V.S. Naipaul, I'd read Kim, I'd read A Passage to India, I had seen Pather Panchali perhaps then. I may have read a book by Paul Scott. Other than that, I knew almost nothing about India. There were very few programs about India on television, and there were very few documentaries in the cinema about India, which is amazing considering that Britain, as it were, administered India only maybe 20 years before, 25 years before. So my ignorance was really dense. I remember looking at a map of Delhi and wondering what it would look like, and I imagined a place of tall Edwardian buildings, but in fact it's a place, as you know, of one-story bungalows. At least New Delhi was in those days. So my ignorance was quite profound. I think nobody probably of the middle class is as ignorant as I was, in that television documentaries now bring the sight of things, bring how things look home to you quite immediately. And one or two recently have done amazing work in Calcutta and Bombay in narratives or stories about people who earn their living from taking, gold and silver from the drains in the jewellery quarter and so on. They have a kind of level of access which would have been unheard of 20, 30 years ago. So I think in that sense people do kind of know more about India. And I think they also find it a less threatening place because it's much more like where they come from than it was when I came. It's always had the reassurance, I think, India, for the British person, of being very unlike home, but also quite like home. It's not like China, which just seems very unlike home, full stop. So there's a kind of familiarity in India, which is quite reassuring. And I think now people know more about it. Whether they kind of know more about it in a fundamental way is a different question. But certainly superficially they do. And it's also less terrifying. I mean, one of my truisms is that, I don't think this is altogether serious, but One of my truths was that V.S. Naipaul hated India so much because there was no bottled water. Had he come when there was bottled water, it would have been absolutely fine. An area of light rather than an area of darkness. I think those little things have made travel here so much, so there's much less to be worried about. I speak at a very basic level of my stomach, but that's a constant fear among the Western traveller to India, which has never really receded. When I first came, I had a supply of those things called Puritabs, ludicrously, and even when people gave me cups of tea, I would sneak one into it and watch it fizz like a little depth charge, which was completely pathetic of me, of course, and I stopped doing that after 2 weeks. But one had a lot of fear in those days of not quite knowing, of contamination, I suppose, almost a kind of Brahminical fear, I suppose, but there it was, and I think a lot of that has receded now. I mean, all kinds of people come to India, people of 80 years old come to India for the first time and enjoy it, and it's not threatening in that sense anymore. Whether you understand more about it is a different question, but they're less scared of it.
And Shati, what was your experience when you were in MIT, for instance, and then you've been abroad many times? How do you think India is viewed by people now, and do they really have an understanding of what's happening currently in the country?
Yeah, but it's the Bollywood films which mess up everything. So many people come up to me and say, "You must have really danced in your wedding." I said, "We never dance in our weddings." And so that is one thing. Familiarity with Indian food, I think, has endeared India a lot in both the UK and the US. I actually found more Indian restaurants there than I ever find in more Chinese restaurants I think we have in Calcutta. And on people themselves, there are still a great many questions on caste, on poverty, and why are the rich not doing enough for the poor. And these questions you do get a lot from students or from what I would say other middle class people who read books. So those are still there. A lot of them do see India as a fascinating country, and there are those who are more serious and want to do research in India on the story of economic growth is fascinating to many of them.
Can I just add that in 1977 or 1980 or even in 1995, it would have been inconceivable that you lived in a country, Britain, in which what remained of the steel industry and what really mattered in the car industry was owned by an Indian gentleman in Bombay. It would have been absolutely inconceivable that. And it's something that has altered. I mean, India has, as Swati says, it's changed its place in the British imagination. Not only is it less to be feared as a traveller, but also it seems in a way much more threatening. I mean, it sometimes seems to people that India is going to rule the world, and however ludicrous that may seem sitting here to you, it does seem that the brightest people come from India and China. If you look at good British universities, there's a tremendous number of Indian and Chinese students at them, and you're aware that you're part of an imperial country, a former imperial country, that has actually finally, in the last, I'd say, 10 years, recognized its fate, which is to be a small but interesting country, partly in Europe and partly not. And that's a big thing to recognize, and I think India has played its part in that kind of self-recognition because of Tata and other things.
Okay, let's open it up to the house and take some questions. Can I see any hands? Okay. Is there a microphone for this gentleman?
Actually, I have two questions. Number one, the city people, when they're reporting about non-city stuff or rural stuff, they have certain biases in them while reporting. How do you overcome that? Number two, like many things, journalism has also gone a sea change in India right now. It's more of opinions rather than reportage that is happening. How is that affecting true journalism?
Good questions, both of you.
Yeah, okay. I'll take the last one first. I mean, reporting, as I said at a meeting yesterday, reporting is quite an expensive thing. You have to pay somebody to go somewhere and find something out, and rely on his experience and his expertise and his skill to do a piece of work, a piece of writing which is informative and veracious, true insofar as it can be true. And for that reason, less so in India, it has to be said, where newspaper circulations are still growing, but very much so in Britain and America, where they're declining very steeply, and where nobody's found a way of monetizing the web successfully. Reporting is going out of fashion because it's too expensive to do. And as a columnist, I can stay at home and I can write 1,200 words and be paid a certain amount of money. But that's the cost to the newspaper. If I was to come to Calcutta at the newspaper's expense and write a piece about Calcutta, the cost would be quite tremendously multiplied from